أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Yousuf Habib. This is going to be my, if I'm not mistaken, 11th presentation of PowerPoint type. What it shows on the left-hand side is that it's Quranic presentation 15, and the 11th through 14th I have with me, and I'll be giving them as and when I feel that it may be appropriate. I've jumped onto this one. Again, this pertains to my topic referring to the Quran. I started with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Zat's presentations, and then went to the Quran, then went to man. I'm returning back to Quran. Once that process gets finished, then I hope to go into some thematical presentations, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. So today, and this is one of my very favorite presentations. I could have done it in and made it twice as long, but I realized that our attentions tend to kind of waver after a while. And so for the sake of that aspect, I've kept it simpler. And the reason why it's a favorite of mine is because it hits me like a punch that I wouldn't expect and cannot expect. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that personal aspect later on in the talk. So the topic is first 10 ayat of Ash-Shams, utter beauty and wisdom Quran offers men in 10 brief ayat. And pretty much most of the people here, if not all, must have memorized this surah, but if they have not memorized it, no problem. So we'll start with that. And as always, I start with us trying to remind ourselves that respond to this rhetoric question that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala poses us. Why will they not then try to understand, that is, truly reflect upon this Quran? I think it's utterly important that in whatever fashion we can, whatever language we can, we try to understand and reflect upon the Quran, whether it is a surah, whether it is a page, a paragraph, or one ayat, or even a phrase. Now, the first 10 ayat of Ash-Shams, verses 1 through 10 of Surah Ash-Shams, stress the polarity. By polarity, I mean opposing tendencies. Stress the polarity inherent in all creation, and because we are human, most importantly, in man. In so doing, these verses also draw a sharp contrast of all creation, including man on the one hand, and the oneness and uniqueness of the Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on the other. Now, this latter part, oneness and uniqueness of the Creator, Allah ta'ala, on the other, does not come into manifest here in this talk, but realize that when we do that, when we go through this, look at the polarity, the opposing tendencies that are inherent in creation, and most importantly in us, that when all that is being told us, in the back of it, by way of reference, we should say, however, as far as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is concerned, there is no polarity there. There's only oneness, and there is only uniqueness of Him, because He is the Creator. We are merely the creations. And the last two verses, 9 and 10, I believe, bring the message of this passage, the passage being 1 through 10 ayat. It brings the message for man into a sharp focus. And what is that message? It's a message that we can take it by way of a question. What will man aspire to given the tensions, remember I mentioned the polarity, opposing tendencies, given the tension arising from this polarity that is inherent in Allah's creation, man. So, what will man aspire to, given the tension arising from this polarity that is inherent in Allah's creation, man? So that is by way of introduction of this topic. Now, since 7 of these ayat, the first 7 of these ayats are in essence oaths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes, the brief discourse made on the letter Waw of the oath just last week, if I believe I did that presentation, is restated here because I think it is important, at least from my perspective, my selfish perspective, that I restate this because, as I said, the first 7 ayats are indeed beginning with the letter Waw, which in this case is meant for oaths taken by Allah. So as I said before in the previous presentation, the conventional translations translate Waw as by in English. The word by is supposed to then imply, doesn't obviously state, imply that Allah Ta'ala is taking an oath by whatever that follows that particular word by. Now that Allah deems it to be necessary to take an oath implies that Allah is asking man to pay close attention to what He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will be saying. However, the translated word by in English, and we are talking in English and referring to matter in English language. So the word by on its own does not draw the reader's attention to the seriousness or significance that is implied here. Meanwhile, insofar as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is concerned, it is as if He is saying, pay attention to this now and reflect upon this now. In other words, with the letter Waw here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, consider what I'm going to say now. To put it succinctly and authoritatively, Allah with the letter Waw is saying, consider this. It is as if He is now commanding you, which is what the exclamation point is supposed to say to you. Consider this. And of course, you will see tons of time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using the verb in the command form. It's called amr, fa'al amr. So, qul, that is another example of amr, which is drawing attention by way of giving an order. So here, the way I see the letter Waw as meaningfully translated with its intent embedded in it in English would be, consider this with an exclamation mark. So this then is the alternative translation proposed and used for Waw in this presentation, as I did for the prior presentation as well. So here with then the translation of the 10 ayat. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا. Consider the sun and its radiant brightness. One oath, but it comprises 2 aspects, the sun and its subsequent radiant brightness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is drawing our attention to the phenomenon we call the sun, a physical phenomena we are aware of, and all the consequences that arise from this creation. Here, simply stated in 2 words, it's radiant brightness. But if we reflect upon it, there's a whole science, there is a whole world, so to say, in that meaning, radiant brightness. Number 2, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. And consider the moon as it follows the sun, thereby deriving sun's light and reflecting it. So again, as in the first one, it says, consider the moon, وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا, when it follows. Follows what? Ha. Ha refers here to the sun, thereby deriving sun's light and reflecting it. You may notice that in these first two ayat, there is an element of this and that. There is the sun and then there is the moon. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, and consider the day as it displays the sun's glory. إِذَا جَلَّاهَا, and consider the day as it displays the sun's glory. That is, as it reveals the world, as it were. So the day as it displays the sun's glory reveals the world, as it were. وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, I'm sorry. وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا, and consider the night as it covers the sun's glory. Yaksha, covers, hides. Ha, again referring to sun. So, and consider the night as it covers the sun's glory, that is, it veils the earth, as it were. These are cosmic phenomenon that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is drawing our attention to in order to impress upon us the enormity of the cosmos, the enormity of the phenomena which we observe, which we are part of, which we partake of, and which we live in and around. وَالسَّمَاءِ وَمَا بَنَاهَا, and consider the sky, the visible cosmos, and how He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, built it. That is, how He put together the wondrous qualities which are responsible for the harmony and coherence of these visible cosmos. You know, look at the enormity and look at the expanse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala draws man's attention to. Asks him in all his seriousness by way of swearing this phenomena, whether it's a philosopher, whether it's a scientist, whether it's an average human being, this should put awe in his heart as to how perfectly the picture is drawn by this very seriousness of the highest entity. وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا دَحَاهَا, and consider the earth and how He spread it, how He spread out the qualities that are responsible for the beauty and the variety of the earth's expanse. You know, an environmentalist would not be able to bring together in these short words, وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا دَحَاهَا, the beauty and the ni'mah that has been spread on this earth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not take this for granted. Look at the beauty, look at the ni'mah that I have spread on this place called the earth, in which I have given you and sent you as a vice regent, and reflect upon it. So here are the first 6 ayat, the first 6 oaths subhanallah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken, and He can ask us to consider it seriously, to reflect upon it, to bring it into all together. So Allah swears through a series of 6 oaths about the physically perceptible creation: the sun, the moon, the day, the night, the heavens, and the earth. In these 6 ayat, there is a call from Allah, a call through Him swearing, a call through Him asking us to consider. There is a call from Allah for man to consider the inexplicable grandeur of the universe insofar as it's perceptible, as it is perceptible and comprehensible to man. And it presents it as a compelling evidence of His creative power. Subhanallah. Ayat number 7. Now here the nature of this particular proposal from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes a turn. Heretofore, we had 6 physical phenomena that we live with, that are around us, that we experience every day. In the 7th one, he then says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. He goes into something that is not perceptible to us as something that is out there, that is, you can touch and feel. No. Consider the human soul, more simply, the human personality, and I'll have more to say about that, and how Allah formed it. Consider this personality and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fashioned it. In this world, Allah swears for this first 7th time. The first 6 times, the oaths pertain to the physically perceptible phenomena of creation. However, this oath, as opposed to the previous 6, is about the physically imperceptible and inexplicable life essence, if you will, of man, loosely described as soul. So keep that in mind. It's the life essence he's drawing attention to. A life essence that is primarily inside of us, which is why I say it's imperceptible, and it is a counterpoint to the first 6 oaths, which are on perceptible aspects, phenomenon of the cosmos and the earth that he has drawn attention to. Now, the verse also points out how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fashioned this soul in accordance with what it is meant to be. Savva ha. Savva, formed. Savva, fashioned. Savva ha, fashioned it. Ha is it. So there is an implied allusion to the extremely complex phenomenon of a life entity inside of us, the life entity, in which our bodily needs and our bodily urges, positive and negative, the emotions that we call that which comes out of our heart, and the intellectual activities, that what we call thought process, these needs and urges, these emotions, and these intellectual activities are so closely intertwined that they are indissoluble. In other words, you cannot know where one begins and one ends. Where your need begins and your need, before it ends, an urge comes in, positive or negative. The emotive power of your heart, how it emotes positively or negatively. The intellectual activities, your mind, your thought processes, and you have infinite variety of the spectrum of goodness and badness that your thought process brings in. All this is called your life entity. All this, he says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. Consider all this. This, what you call your soul, you may want to call it your personality, you may call it yourself, you may call it your physical and your inner self, you may call your life entity. Consider this, and then consider how he fashioned it, how he has savva it. It is mind-boggling that in this, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا, he has conjured up for you a picture which encompasses all this phenomena, which you as a man would say, this is more than those 6 phenomena that he just related to me. And how he does it in such a succinct and absolutely brilliantly brief manner. Now those 7 oaths are finished. In the 8th ayat, he now says, what else has he done to this soul after he has fashioned it? And وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. Look at it. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. If you want to just abbreviate it, only 3 words. There are many more words in it, but basically 3 words. Look what he says in these 3 words. And consider how he inspires it. Ha, alhama, ha, it. We spoke about that it in the prior ayat. The soul, human personality, inner self, your physical self, and your inner self, your life entity. Consider how he takes all this, your soul, and how he inspires it, the human soul, with moral failings, fujuraha, its moral failings, as well as consciousness of him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, taqwaha, its taqwa, the soul's taqwa, the human personality's taqwa. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. And consider how he inspires it, the human soul, with moral failings as well as with consciousness of Allah. I said 7 notes. Here I have added the word consider again, but consider, if you will, not pun intended here, that this 8th ayah is a continuation of the 7th ayah. So the 2 ayat together form one oath on his part, where he says, consider this nafs and how he shaped it, and consider then how he inspires it with the tendencies, opposing tendencies, the polarity of moral failings on the one hand and consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, taqwa, on the other. An alternate translation that I also enjoy is, and consider how he inspires it or imbues in the human self to know its own potential for rebellion, as well as its potential for piety, that is consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Same purpose, same meaning served, said in slightly different words. And I have 2 or 3 other translations, but I will not bother you on those. But the point is well made. After he has drawn a panorama of expanse out there, and then brought it all the way into your inner self, introduced to you your entity, your life essence, if you will, and then tells you how he has fashioned it, and then tells you on top of it how he alhamaha, how he imbues it, how he inspires it with these 2 tendencies, and you're just awed. What is he going to say next? So let me mention about this ayat first. So after the 7 oaths taken in the prior 7 verses, in verse 8, the Qur'an then makes an important statement. The human soul is capable of receiving inspiration and insight, and it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is the source of this inspiration. This is indicated by the use of the verb alhamaha. He, Allah, inspired it, the soul. And what did he inspire in the human soul? Allah inspired in the human self its potential for immoral doings, fujur, and its potential for Allah consciousness, taqwa. That is what he inspired in it. Alhamaha, inspired in it. That is what he imbued in us. The soul thereby has been given insight, inspiration to be able to discern between right and wrong, between immoral doings and being Allah conscious. This is essentially a moral dilemma. No doubt, resolution of this dilemma requires man to use his intellect. Equally important, however, the heart, the qalb that is, and or the conscience, the dhamir as it is, also play the role. Now, why do I say that? Because if you see in ayat 6, nafsin wa ma sawwaha, in that fashioning, he introduces that as a life essence, an entity that comprises the elements of your intellect, the elements of your qalb, the emotive power, and the dhamir. The dhamir comes in, your conscience comes in by what was said in Ayat 8, Alhamaha fujuraha wa taqwa, capability, the potential for doing this and that, and leaving for you this moral dilemma, shall I do this or shall I do that? So it's a dilemma, but the resolution of it requires man to use not only his intellect, but also his qalb. What does his heart say? And also then ultimately, what does his conscience, his dhamir says? Look how beautiful this construct is coming together. Verse 8 again thus indicates a dual potentiality within the soul. By this time, I'm sure it is clear to what potential I'm referring to here. It thereby alludes to the human self's responsibility and accountability. This he has given to the sun, to the moon, to the day, to the night, to the skies, to the earth. He has not given this potentiality. To you, he has given this potentiality, and with that potentiality then comes the responsibility and the accountability. So, in having given the potentiality to this entity called the soul, the inner self, the combination of external and inner self, call it what you will, to yourself, to you. It alludes to your responsibility and accountability because you have been endowed with the capacity to discern and the ability to choose the right course of action, or alternatively to opt for the corrupt path. Together then, Ayat 7 and Ayat 8, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَبَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, describe the essential characteristic of human nature as such. In its deepest sense, man's ability to act wrong is concurrent with his ability to act rightly. Ways it's in balance. Your soul is in a state of equilibrium. It's a healthy tension. There is a tension that is always going on, this or this. But base case, base premise, it is in equilibrium. It is balanced, which is why qist, balance, comes often in the Qur'an, which is why we say he's just. He didn't just give you this, he gave you that also. And therefore, he gave you the responsibility and accountability, and therefore, he is going to use his justice, and he will be just, but he will be doing the justice for this equilibrium. What did you do? Which was heavy, which was light? So, this beautiful picture having been brought from the cosmos all the way to your microcosm of inner self, in other words, this inherent polarity, opposing tendency in man, which gives to his every right choice a moral value, and his choice to do wrong an absence of moral value. This inherent, inborn polarity, this opposing tendencies in men, endows him thus with what has come to be known as man's moral free will. A real moment to pause here. Ultimately, this is where we come in. Man's moral will with an option. You buy a stock, then there is an option to buy or sell. You buy into this, and there is an option. Shall I do this or shall I do that? You become a human being wholesome. You say, this is given to me as a gift. This therefore becomes my responsibility. And if I am sensible, I know that from responsibility as a consequence arises accountability. And then he subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am just. I will do justice, but it is a justice born of being just. I will not be unjust. But the moral free will is man's. So now, here comes the important part and the purpose of my talk. So what does the Quran say then? You have done these 8 ayat. What does the Quran say then? Indeed, what does the Quran say after it has given 8 magnificent insights in the first 8 ayat just described? After priming the man by way of 7 oaths, after drawing man's attention to those 7 considerations and what indeed is Allah leading by way of an ultimate message. The ultimate message Allah is drawing man's attention to here is spelled out in ayat 9 and 10. The message in ayat 9 and 10 is in essence the result and consequences of informed choices that were described and set out for man in ayat 7 and 8. This message of ayat 9 and 10 is stated so clearly that it would not necessitate any further elaboration on this unequivocal declaration of the Quran. Meanwhile, the message is nothing less than a profound wisdom presented in the most succinct and majestic manner. Here these are. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Ayat 9, ayat 10. I'll repeat. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Translation in English, the one who purifies it, his soul, his self, his life essence, his life entity, his personality, the one who purifies his soul succeeds. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The one who zakka it, aflaha, succeed. And the one who corrupts it fails. And the one who corrupts this life essence, corrupts this life entity, corrupts this self of his, corrupts this inner and external self of his, if he corrupts it, he fails. Qad khaba, he fails. Man dassaha, who corrupts. Another translation of it I like. Indeed, to a happy state shall attain he who causes his soul to grow in purity, and truly lost is he who buries his soul in darkness. Now keep this Arabic Quranic ayat in mind. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. The ayat are simply comprised of 4 operative verbs, 4 verbs in it. Aflaha, succeeds. Dassaha, aflaha, ha is it. Ha means soul. Okay. Aflaha, dassaha, fails. Zakkaha, purifies it, succeeds it. Dassaha, fails it. Zakkaha, purifies it. Khaba, corrupts it. 4 operative verbs only. A word of emphasis that appears twice, qad. It means indeed. It's a word of emphasis. Indeed. Indeed. Qad, indeed. And a relative pronoun, man, the one who. Man. Indeed, qad aflaha. He succeeds. Man, the one who. Zakka, purifies it, his soul, his life essence, his entity. Wa and qad, indeed. Khaba, corrupts. The one who, man, Dasa, fails. It is so. It couldn't be simpler. It could not be more simply put. Let's go now to the ayat 9. The one who purifies his soul succeeds, or indeed a happy state shall attain he who causes his soul to grow in purity. This verse declares that true success, prosperity, and salvation, all encompassed in the word falah, meaning acquiring Allah's grace, His rahmah thereby, and ultimate admittance to Jannah, will be attained by, as the verse says, he who purifies his soul. Zakah. Zakaha is the usual form 2 usage of the verb zakah. And so it gives the meanings of bringing about or causing growth and development, or in the more broad sense, purification. The pronoun ha, as I've mentioned before, attached to the verb zakah is feminine. Hu would be masculine, ha is feminine, and so obviously it refers to nafs. Nafsin ma sawwaha. It refers to nafs, which in Arabic grammar is feminine. Nafs in Arabic grammar is feminine, which is why you see ha, zakaha, dasaha, sawaha. Thus, verse 9 in the broadest sense would mean he who has caused his soul to grow, to be reformed, developed, and purified has indeed attained true success, prosperity, and salvation. Same thing, qad aflaha man zakkaha. An early scholar along those lines opined the meaning of verse 9 as he who has purified his soul through obedience to Allah and cleansed it from lowly and base characteristics and vices has indeed attained true success. Ayat 9. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. And the one who corrupts his soul fails, alternatively, and truly lost is he who buries his soul in what? In darkness. So as a diametric opposite of aflaha and zakkaha in verse 9, the verse 10 comes in as a counterpoint. Whosoever selects the path of corruption, khaba, will indeed have failed, the saha. The conjugation used for corruption is the saha. The meaning of this verb is to hide, to conceal, to bury. The implication of using this term is that the person in question would commit sins, disbelief, and be disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much that his soul would be submerged in these reprehensible acts to the extent that his soul would be buried in them and thus buried in utter darkness. Now 9 and 10 together, the literal meaning of purify zakah is grow. And according to a large number of commentators, the leading literal meaning of corrupt, dasa, is to bury. Verse 9 thus indicates those who make soul grow through purification, while verse 10 indicates those souls who are buried in the darkness of their own reprehensible acts. These verses could thus be literally translated as he prospers who grows it, and he fails who buries it. Ibn Kathir, a famous scholar of a millennium ago, offers the following on these ayat. These ayats speak of those who cleanse their souls of lowly and despicable character traits, and conversely those who dull their soul by neglecting it through heedlessness and disobedience. To close this brief discourse on ayat 9 and 10, These ayat rhyme in harmony. They are so compact, so brief, and yet so profound, so full of life-changing wisdom. The brevity and the poetic construct of قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا is as stunning as is the wisdom embedded in it. Now, before I make these concluding remarks, let me pause here for a minute. If I take these 10 ayats and the picture that I have drawn for you, a visual picture of sorts that I've drawn for you, you would find that these encompass 10 straight lines, 10 lines. The first 6 comprised physical phenomena. The next 2 comprised the inner phenomena, inner self of man, how he, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, comprised this life essence, how he fashioned it, how he imbued in it an inspiration, and how he then gave it the dual potentiality and left it. He then left it. And then he says what he says in ayat 9 and 10. This composite, when we read quickly, it takes us maybe 30 seconds to us. I have done hundreds, if not thousands, of presentations in my career. I have worked with a consultant that is the largest consultant in the world for 8 years. I was an external senior advisor. Pardon my personal bringing in, but there's a purpose to it. McKinsey & Company. And to my mind, they do the best presentations on multiple subjects because they are world's largest management consultants. And I have seen presentations that blow my mind away. The beautiful way, and they are paid princely for those, you know. I remember one of time they were giving a presentation to our oil minister, and I was there. And the oil minister said, yeah, you know, but boy, are you expensive. And with very straight face, this man, this senior partner who I worked with said, yes, but doesn't it sum up nicely? And I looked at this composite and I said to myself, doesn't it look nice? Isn't it precious? Isn't this priceless? This composite, which takes you 30 seconds to read, which is in it, which brings in the essence. He prefaces 7 and 8, and then 9 and 10 with 6 oaths. He prefaces your inner self, your life entity with an oath. He then says, after this, it is so important that I'm going to give you an additional thing. And then he says, if you do this, here it is. And what is this? Tazkiyat an-nafs, purification of the soul. Tazkiyat an-nafs as a phrase does not appear in the Qur'an. But the word zakkaha and the word nafs together only appear here. Qad aflaha man zakka in the Quran. But this tazkiyat an-nafs, qad aflaha man zakkaha, has become like a mantra, like a Quranic paradigm. It has become a Quranic paradigm over the centuries. And many commentators have said that this tazkiyat an-nafs indeed is the whole purpose of the Quran. Why do I dwell on it? I dwell on it because those who know 1,000,000 times more than us have said, this purification of the soul is the purpose of the Quran. He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, introduces it to you, Qad aflaha man zakkaha, after swearing 7 times, after introducing this phenomena of potentialities into you, and then he says, Qad aflaha man zakkaha. This tazkiyatan nafs is something that we need to take with us. And we say, what shall we make of it? Now, in the Quran, at least in 4 ayat, you will see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that it is He who gives this tazkiyah to man. Fair enough. In several other ayat, He refers to it that it is through the prophets and messengers that He has sent this tazkiyah to you. And one specific ayat comes in wherein He says to our Prophet, peace be upon him, give this. Tell them that it is through charity that you can purify your soul. If someone comes and asks you, tell them, give of your wealth, and it'll grow, and it'll purify. It'll purify ultimately your life essence. It'll purify ultimately your soul. Now, whether we take this as only coming from Allah and only He willing it, whether we take it as He sends us through His messengers, or whether we just focus it upon it as ourselves, the point for us as people, as individuals is, let us take this as an implementation that is incumbent upon us to do. Forget about the fact that He is the source. Forget about the fact that the messages have been sent to tell us in various ways how to purify it. Ultimately, it is upon me to implement this process of purification, this tazkiyat al-nafs. I have to implement it. This is my burden, or this is my blessing to bear or to carry out forward. So in conclusion of this brief discourse on the first 10 ayat of Surah Al-Nafs, Allah has created nafs primarily in a form of equilibrium that I mentioned to you earlier. He inspires the soul and He gives it insight so that the soul is able to differentiate between the right action and sin. The result of this ability to choose leads ultimately to nafs undergoing a process of purification, this tazkiyah, or a process of defilement, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave in ayat 10 as a counterpoint. Punch 1, Qad aflaha man zakkaha, lest you not forget that this is all you will have. If it was only this, malaika would have been enough. He gives you the counterpoint in 10. So, the result of this ability to choose leads ultimately to the nafs undergoing a process of purification, tazkiyah, or a process of defilement, corruption, tadsiya. This then has enormous consequences for the self in the hereafter, obviously. The responsibility, remember, the accountability, remember. But you take solace in the fact that He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will be just in His injustice. Man takes the impetus regarding the process of tazkiyah, purification, or tadsiyah, corruption, where the decisions he takes in all his moments of his life. Since he has been endowed with the faculty of discernment, that is, differentiating between good and evil, taking the course of right action or a path of misguidance. Verses 9 and 10 have served as an inspiration for extensive literature on the purification of the soul, as I mentioned, tazkiyat al-nafs, which some argue is the entire purpose of the Qur'an. Verse 9 expresses it. Verse 10 is brought in as a counterpoint to show man how he could nullify the success that is brought in Ayat 9, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. Allah chooses to send this profound message in a brief, succinct, and harmonious fashion after drawing man's serious attention to the 7 oaths he takes that encompass the physical creation as well as the non-physical essence, the soul, which he inspires to differentiate between right and wrong, the moral failings, and the Allah consciousness in ayats 7 and 8. If in 10 brief ayat, a life-changing message is delivered from the Omnipotent, prefaced by his profound oaths, how can one fail to call it anything? Anything but a revelation. Anything but a revelation that is nothing short of a miracle. And they used to ask the Prophet to bring a miracle if he was truly a prophet. Subhanallah. Here are the 10 concluding remarks I just mentioned. I apologize.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك اللهم لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا شر ما قضيت. اللهم ادخلنا برحمتك في عبادك الصالحين. اللهم اخرجنا من ظلمات الجهل والوهم إلى نور العلم. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. اللهم اكفنا بحلالك عن حرامك وبطاعتك عن معصيتك وفضلك عن من سواك. اللهم بفضلك ورحمتك على كلمة الحق والدين. اللهم انصر الإسلام وأعز المسلمين يا أكرم الأكرمين. Oh Allah, spread your mercy upon us, shower us with your blessings, increase our knowledge, grant us forgiveness, and reward us with the company of the prophets in the Firdaus al-A'la. Oh Allah, purify our heart, strengthen our faith, increase our knowledge, and make us benefit from what you have taught us. Amen. Oh Allah, forgive our parents and all our friends and relatives who have passed away. Oh Allah, grant them your mercy. Make their graves guarded from heaven and grant them the Firdaus al-A'la. Oh Allah, we have many of our friends and relatives who are sick. Oh Allah, we have our son Ma'raj and our daughter Aisha who have been sick for a while. Oh Allah, grant them and all our friends who are sick full and speedy recovery. Amen. Oh Allah, guide our children, protect them and make them righteous. Oh Allah, grant us the power and the ability that we may be grateful for the favor that you have bestowed upon us and our parents, and that we may do the righteous deeds that are pleasing to you. Oh Allah, we ask you with every name you have elected for yourself, that none of us leave this gathering, but his pains have been relieved, his worries have been removed, his debts have been paid, his weaknesses have been concealed, his sins have been forgiven, and his needs have been fulfilled. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.